I'd like to start out by asking you a question. How many people like to lose all the time? How many people like to win? You know, I like to win so much when you're playing those little games that have the hourglass. If you're not looking at me, I'm going tap, 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 tap to get that sand to fall through a little quicker because I like to win. But the unfortunate thing is today, most Christians are in the same position. You see, most Christians are playing a game where they're on the defense all the time. And if you play a game and all you have is defense and you have no offense, what's the best you can hope to do? Tie, and most of the time you're going to lose. Do you have trouble answering questions about your faith? Is this you? I've been there. When someone asks, where did Cain get his wife? What about 8 men? How did Noah get all the animals on the ark? What about the millions of years? Is evolution true? What about the Big Bang? You just bury your head in the sand or you just don't have an answer. You see, we're all commanded to have an answer. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer. So what I'd like to do today is give you some answers. Our topic today will be thousands, not billions of years. And we're going to use some scientific evidence to support a young earth position. But we should always use our Bible as our starting point and our foundation. How many of you believe in the beginning God created? How many of you believe God created in 6 little 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago? How many of you believe dinosaurs and fossils are millions of years old? Believe it or not, 70% of Christians believe the universe is very old, perhaps even billions of years. It's hard to be a Christian and accept the Bible's history of creation as literal when the world is telling us otherwise. Most people think that history in Genesis is just an allegory. Well, you might ask, well, what's an allegory? It's a symbolic representation. Let me ask you this. Do you believe Moses was a real person who actually existed in history? Do you think God gave Moses those 10 commandments and that it was an actual event in history? Do you believe you can understand the meaning of the 10 commandments? How about this? Thou shalt not steal. Do we believe that to be true? Or is that an allegory? How about thou shalt not murder? Is that an allegory? Well, we hope not. Let's go to the 4th commandment in Exodus 28. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Why should we keep it holy? Let's read the rest of the 4th commandment. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So we can believe from the Bible that Moses was a real man who existed in history. The 10 commandments were really given to Moses and was an event in history. And when God said he made everything in 6 days, it really was 6 days. So who wrote those 10 commandments anyway? Was it God or Charlton Heston? Well, we read in Exodus 31:18, and he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. And then again in Deuteronomy 9:10, and the Lord delivered unto me 2 tables of stone, written with the finger of God. So God himself wrote with his finger that he created in 6 days. This was an actual event that God performed in history. Guess what? The time period of a week has no astronomical meaning, such as a day, a month, or a year. This 7 days is to be a pattern for us to live by. Long days of creation would ultimately destroy the 4th commandment and our week. Unfortunately, here's what's happening today.
I don't like it when the Bible talks about hell or God's judgment.
Well then, you need the Erasable Bible.
The Erasable Bible?
A Bible completely printed with the same graphite used in number 2 pencils. Now you can easily remove that objectionable material.
Now I can read only the parts I want?
That's right. Pick and choose which doctrine you want to follow.
As a pastor, I used to be concerned about how I would preach on those difficult parts of the Bible. Now with my Erasable Bible, I don't challenge or offend anyone, and my congregation loves me all the more.
Thanks, Erasable Bible, for allowing me to live my lifestyle.
We read in 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 4, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itchy ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. I really believe that time has come, and evolution with its billions of years is one of those myths. Proverbs 30, 5 through 6 says, every word of God is pure. Add thou not unto his words. But you know what? We've added millions of years on evolution to our biblical doctrine. The gap theory, age theory, frame hypothesis, progressive creation, theistic evolution, they are not secular theories, but Christians trying to fit millions or billions of years into the Bible. We have compromised and changed God's Word to appeal to the world. This is one thing we mustn't do. God's Word, the Bible, is true from cover to cover. The Bible is our only true history book. It gives us a history of geology, biology, anthropology, and astronomy. And the Bible has answers. It tells us who created. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The Bible tells us what was created. In Colossians 1:16 through 17, for by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether it be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things are created by him and for him. The Bible tells us how it was created. Psalm 33:6, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made. In Hebrews 11:3, through faith we understand that the words were framed by the what? The Word of God. The Bible tells us when it was created. And we all know from Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. And the Bible tells us how long did it take to create? 6 days. Before we get into the evidences for young Earth, let's take a look at some of the discrepancies that we see in the secular literature. This is what the evolutionists call the geologic column. This is actually only exists in this slide and in textbooks. Nowhere in the fossil record are these animals arranged in this neat little order. Now there's some order because different creatures lived in different environments. Sea creatures who lived on the ocean floor would have been the first to be buried. And 95% of all fossils in the world are marine sea creatures. Oh, by the way, in the Cambrian layer, we see fully formed representatives of most kinds of animals. What do we don't see in the Precambrian layer? We see none of the billions of transitional fossils that are required to lead up to the animals in the Cambrian layer. One big whopping indiscrepancy. In 1994 in Australia, they drilled down into the lava flow and found some wood that had been overflowed with lava. The wood was carbonized, but not petrified. They dated the basalt layer at 45 million years and the wood at 45,000 years. 45,000-year-old wood and 45 million-year-old lava is a whopping big indiscrepancy. The famous Bolshevik mammoth was carbon dated, one part at 29,500 years old and another part of the same animal at 44,000 years old. That's another big whopping discrepancy. Let's put the evolutionary timeline next to the creation timeline. The evolutionary timeline says 15 billion years ago, the Big Bang happened. 10 billion years ago, the stars formed. 5 billion years ago, the sun came into existence. 4.5 billion years ago, the earth was a molten ball. And 3.8 billion years ago, the first oceans formed. The biblical creation account says day 1 and 2, it was covered with water. The earth was covered with water. Day 3, dry land and plants. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, sea and flying creatures. Day 6, land animals and man. So we can see two completely different versions of creation, and one is right and one is wrong. Another big whopper of a discrepancy. So if you believe that God could have used evolution, you need to reread Genesis. The Wollemi pine, by the evolutionist worldview, extinct for 220 million years, rediscovered in Australia. They call it a living fossil. At top is a fossil of a coelacanth, its supposed missing link, a low-fin fish by evolutionary standards, extinct for 65 million years. Yet in 1933, a live one was caught off the coast of Indonesia, and we see them turning up in fish markets all over the world today. Yet another what? A big whopping discrepancy. All the time I get Christians calling or emailing me when someone new transitional fossil was reported in the news. Through my extensive research, I may have found just a true transitional fossil. Is this evidence for evolution? What I can't figure out is the left fossil turning into the right fossil, or is the right fossil turning into the left one? You know, maybe they were just made in their own kind. All the supposed transitional fossils reported today have been rebuked or require a vivid imagination with no scientific evidence. Do you know there are literally hundreds of age dating methods that show that the earth is less than millions or billions of years old? Let's just take a look at a few of them. If Noah's flood was about 4,400 years ago, you would not expect to find a desert that was older than 4,400 years. The Sahara Desert has a prevailing westerly wind that causes the desert to grow. In this picture, we see the past, present, and possible future extent of the Sahara Desert. And you know what? It's getting bigger all the time. The Potsdam Institute for Climate Research Impact Study in Germany in 1999 determined that the Sahara Desert was no older than 4,000 years old. Just what you'd expect to find if there was a global flood about 4,400 years ago. Kind of hard to have a desert in a flood. Here we see the oldest living plant, the bristlecone pine, dated around 4,300 years old. If Noah's flood was about 4,400 years ago, you would not expect to find plants any older than that. And you know what? We don't. If Noah's flood was 4,400 years ago, you would not expect to find a coral reef over 400 or over 4,000 years old. In World War II, a lot of damage was done to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. And in the 60s, an environmental group wanted to know how long it would take to regrow the coral reefs. They watched it for 30 years. At the rate of regrowth, they calculated that the reef could not be over 4,200 years old. Exactly what we expect to find if a global catastrophic flood destroyed the whole world about 4,400 years ago. The Earth's magnetic field has decayed 10% in the last 100 years and 40% in the last 1,000. Although the magnetic field protects us from solar radiation, there's a limit that life can tolerate increases in the magnetic field strength. If the Earth was only hundreds of thousands or millions of years old, life could not have existed. Jupiter's moon, Ganymede, has a strong magnetic field. The magnetic fields are generated by liquid motion of molten metals inside of a body. Ganymede should have cooled solid a billion years ago and have little or no magnetic field. In 2003 in Montana, secular paleontologists discovered soft tissue in a T-Rex thigh bone. Soft tissue and red blood cells cannot exist for 65 million years, which is when they claim the last of the dinosaurs died out. Evolutionary scientists are scrambling to come up with a plausible scientific explanation. You know what? They have hope, faith, and pray that they will. And I always wonder, who are they praying to? My question is, faith in who? Did you know the Mississippi River deposits about 80,000 tons of sediment an hour at the point it flows into the Gulf of Mexico? That's a lot of dirt eroding off the continent. By uniformitarian processes, there's only about 30,000 years of sediment in the Mississippi River Delta. Now, I'm not saying that those sediments are that old, because we as Bible-believing Christians are aware of the event that would have caused a lot of erosion. If this process had been going on for hundreds of millions of years, the Gulf of Mexico would have been completely filled in. There are only a few thousand years of sediment on the ocean floor. At the rate of current erosion, the continents would erode flat in about 14 million years. Let's look at salt in the ocean. 450 million tons of salt compounds every year erode off the continents and flow into the ocean. The salt output, though, is only 27% of that amount. That means there's more salt going into the ocean than coming out. So if the oceans are millions of years old, the salt content would be so salty we could probably walk across the surface. Currently, the ocean's salt content is about 3.6%. That's about what we'd expect from the oceans that are only a few thousand years old. This is one I really like. Has anyone heard of the Lost Squadron? Well, during World War II, a squadron of P-38s on the way to England got lost in a snowstorm and were running out of fuel and had to belly land on the glacier in Greenland. Then 48 years later, some aviation collectors who had more money than they knew what to do with decided to go find those planes. They thought they would just be able to locate them, dust the snow off, and fly them back. After several failed attempts to locate the planes without success, they tried using ground-penetrating radar. When they were finally found, to their disbelief, the P-38s were buried by 263 feet of ice in only 48 years. To reach them, they invented an interesting way to get down to those planes. They used a boiler to heat water and pumped it into a circular metal disc, which they set on the ice and melted their way down several times to the aircraft. Look close at the photo. What do you notice? Ice rings. Secular scientists use those ice rings to try and prove the glaciers are millions of years old. The problem is, the planes landed in 1942 and were found in 1990. That's 48 years of ice. That's about 5.5 feet per year. Glaciers are 10,000 feet thick, and if you divide that by 5.5 feet per year, that comes to 1,824 years. So we can say that those ice rings don't represent millions of years, but only a few thousand years. Do you know the moon is getting farther away every year? That means in the past it was closer. About 6,000 years ago, it would have been about 845 feet closer. Adam and Eve would have hardly noticed. But if you take that back in time using the same uniformitarian processes that evolutionists use, at only 1/3 the distance, the tides would be hundreds of feet high twice a day. And at 1.4 billion years ago, the moon would be just skimming just above the surface of the Earth. That explains what happened to the tall dinosaurs. They got mooned to death. The Earth's rotation is also slowing down, which means in the past it was rotating faster. And if we go back 3.5 billion years ago when life supposedly arose out of a mythical primordial soup, instead of a 30-mile bulge at the equator, it would be about 3,000 miles, and a day would be about 6.5 hours. The winds from the Coriolis effect would be over 1,000 miles per hour, an impossible condition for life to exist. Let's look at stalactites. You know, in my youth, I was a Boy Scout and an Explorer Scout, and our troop specialty was spelunking or caving. So I've been in a lot of caves, and I've seen a lot of formations, and originally was taught that stalactites and stalagmites, hundreds or thousands or millions of years to form. Carlsbad Cavern in New Mexico at one time had a sign pointing to stalactites that said, these are 20 million years old. Later it said 1 million years old. Later the sign was gone. It was someone with critical thinking skills asked the park ranger if the stalactites were so old, why were they forming on the handrails and the walkways? Here's a picture of a bat that was covered in flowstone before it could be eaten or decay. That doesn't happen over millions of years. A mine in Queensland, Australia had to be closed for 55 years. When it was reopened, this is what they found. If you look real close, you'll see 2 men inside that circle, inside that yellow circle. 55 years, that's how those stalactites form. Looks like in Wyoming they have some pretty hard water. A guy stuck a pipe in this mineral spring, and 100 years later, this is the result. So by good observational evidence and science, we see that stalactites and stalagmites don't take long ages to form. They can form only in a few years. Let's talk about supernova. A supernova is a star that explodes and expands outward. Its brightness may reach 1 billion times that of our sun. Tycho Brahe, a Danish nobleman and astronomer, witnessed a brilliant star explosion 4 centuries ago. Recently, the Calor Alto Observatory in Spain captured this image of that exploded star, now designated supernova RE. Astronomers have observed that about every 30 years a star dies and explodes into a supernova. If the universe is billions of years old, how come there are less than 300 visible supernovae in existence? There should be several hundred million of them. We should see them going off like popcorn in the skies. Are the stars wrong, or is the evolutionism theory wrong? The fact is there are very few supernova remnants which indicate a very young universe. Comets are dusty ice balls that orbit the sun. They lose mass as the solar winds strip away their surface. Short period comets have life expectancies of less than 10,000 years, yet we still see them. Another evidence for a young solar system. Let's take a look at the model of evolution. Webster's dictionary defines a word that ends in ism as a belief, doctrine, cause, or theory. So from now on, when I say evolution, I'm going to attach the word ism to it. Evolution without the ism indicates it's a fact. We're going to use the scientific laws of probability to prove evolution is a false belief and goes against observational science. About 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth formed. Chemicals formed in a primordial soup. Chemicals bonded together to form molecules. Molecules bonded together to make a living cell, and we get the evolutionist formula, time plus chance equals life. To see if this non-scientific formula is possible, let's define a few terms first. In the early 1950s, 2 scientists tried to recreate what they assumed the early Earth atmospheric conditions were when life supposedly spontaneously formed. Methane, hydrogen, and ammonia were introduced in a closed system, and energy by way of a spark was added to simulate the early Earth atmosphere. The Miller-Urey experiment, which happened when I was not even 1 year old yet, produced a few amino acids in a controlled laboratory experiment. What was resulted was a mixture of right and left-handed amino acids. This experiment was hailed as having created the building blocks of life in the laboratory. Nothing could be farther from the truth. What is required to just make the building blocks of life? Well, let's go back to school for a moment and define some terms. An atom. What is an atom? It's a basic unit of matter. How about the molecule? It's a specific arrangement of atoms such as H2O, 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 of oxygen. What is an amino acid? It's a combination of molecules. What is a protein? It's a specific arrangement of amino acids. There are over 2,000 naturally occurring amino acids, and of these, only 20 are in every living thing on Earth. That's why we can eat other organic compounds. Of the 20 amino acids listed in life, they are all left-handed. Look at my left hand and my right hand. They look the same, don't they? But what they are, they're actually mirror images of each other. At the molecular level, molecules, amino acids, and proteins are three-dimensional. Try to put a left-handed glove on your right hand. It won't fit. Neither will a right-handed amino acid fit in an all left-handed position protein. Evolutionism says given enough time, anything could happen. Do you think given enough time that this formation could happen? Absolutely not. You could have a tornado go back and forth through a junkyard for eternity. It will never assemble a 747. How do we know that? The laws of probability. Scientific use of statistical analysis shows that by the laws of probability, an event will never happen if the odds are greater than 10 to the 50th power. This number is so large that it is difficult to grasp. What are the odds of winning the Powerball? 2.9 times 10 to the 8th power. And I had to up that because they added numbers to the Powerball. What are the odds of being struck by lightning? 10 to the 6th power. That means you'd have to be struck by lightning 29 times before you win the Powerball. And that's each time you play. For those who play, good luck. The number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th power. And for a single small protein comprised of 200 all left-handed amino acids, 10 to the 191st power. And for a single cell to randomly form, one time, 10 to the 40,000th power. So what we have proved by using the laws of probability that life could never have happened on its own, that there must be a creator God. A lot of times when scientists talk about life, they usually start with a simple cell. Darwin did that, not about how that cell got here, and Darwin thought a cell was a blob of jelly. So how simple is a simple cell? In the movie No Intelligence Allowed by Ben Stein, he challenges academia on the ridicule of anyone in teaching a position if they believe in an intelligence that possibly could have created the universe. Here's a clip out of the movie where we get some idea of just how simple a cell is.
Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut. What do we now know that a cell is?
More complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in a cell as far as we know now?
A world that Darwin never could have imagined.
I needed someone who could give me a glimpse into this world. So we went to molecular biologist Doug Axe.
Think of a cell as being a nanofactory, a factory where, on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the two helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make proteins. We have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
see the cell outside and how complicated this cell membrane is. We go inside, there's a structure that develops to support the cell. You see all kind of factories. You see transportation systems being built, enzymes building transportation systems, moving compounds to and for, and when those are done, enzymes take those same atoms, molecules, amino acids, recirculate. Look at the nucleus and nuclear pores, and they're very specific on what they allow in and allow out. Go inside the nucleus, what we see is DNA, library that houses information on how a cell operates.
I'm finally just beginning to grasp the complexity of the cell. Are there systems within the cell that go well beyond Darwinian evolution? Some type of cellular technology that drives adaptation, replication, quality control, and repair? What if these new mechanisms have massive design implications? Well, I say, so be it.
The cell really is like nothing we've ever seen in the physical world. That's got to be firmly grasped. That's not something we can just say, oh, well, it's just a little bit more of the same old, same old. It's not the same old, same old.
We are finding is that there's information that's in the cell that cannot be accounted for in terms of these undirected material causes. So there's,
it has to be.
And so there's some other, so it has to be an information source.
So one of the key questions faced by modern biology is, where do you get information from?
Well, information can be compared to a code system and is always a result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized, though, that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required for the creation of information. Information scientist Dr. Werner Gitt, in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, states this: there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. You know, the evolutionists cannot explain where did the matter come from, how do you get life from non-life, and where did the information in the cell originate. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon. Evolutionist scientists say that the strata we observe here is a result of millions or billions of years. But an event happened in 1980 that shows that it doesn't take millions of years to create those layers of strata. It was the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Here are three distinct observable layers and events that happened at Mount St. Helens. The lower layer happened during a 9-hour eruption on May the 8th, 1980. The middle layer was laid down on June 12th, 1980 from 9 p.m. and resulted in a 25-foot stratification from a pyroclastic flow. The top layer was a mud flow that occurred on March 19th, 1982. All of those layers of strata you see here do not represent years. They represent the sorting action of flowing material that happened in hours, not millions of years. It doesn't take millions of years to create strata. We've all heard of carbon-14. It's a method used to date dead things that were once alive. Carbon-14 is formed in the atmosphere when cosmic rays from the sun strike nitrogen atoms. This has caused the stable nitrogen atom to change into an unstable radioactive carbon atom. During our lifetime, we breathe air and eat plants that have this radioactive isotope. When we die, we no longer breathe or eat. The carbon-14 levels start to decrease, and this can be measured. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. I'm going to give you an example of what a half-life is. If I hold my hand out here and I have 8 atoms of carbon-14, in 5,732 years, there'll be 4. Another 5,730 years, there'll be 2. Another 5,730 years, there'll be 1. The Institute of Creation Research's Radioisotope and Age of the Earth Conference study summarizes their research, and they say this: significant levels of carbon-14 are confirmed in coal samples supposedly tens to hundreds of millions of years old. And what's really interesting is the fact that 14 different levels of coal all dated to about the same age, indicating what? They were laid down about the same time. Diamonds, considered to be over 1 billion years old, also contain measurable amounts of carbon-14. ICR's conclusion: the evolutionary worldview of millions or billions of years of Earth's history is now subject to serious challenge. Carbon-14 in coal represents powerful support for a global flood roughly 5,000 years ago. Carbon-14 in diamonds provides tangible observational evidence for a large episode of accelerated decay during Noah's flood. I've talked to secular folks and pastors who say science has proved that the Earth is billions of years old, but here's a quick review of the scientific evidence that we've learned today that shows that the Earth is only thousands, not billions of years old. Living fossils, young deserts, plants, reefs, a rapidly decaying magnetic field, soft tissue and dinosaur fossil bones, Mississippi River sediment, continental erosion, salt in the ocean, lost squadron ice rings, recession of the moon, Earth's rotation and the Coriolis effect, stalactites, supernova remnants, short period comets, and carbon-14 in coal and diamonds. We read in Colossians 1:16 through 17, "For by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether it be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by all things consist." Just look at his creation.